Girls kind of got sentenced to the institution, but then once they were in there, they were also heavily observed and policed. Girls were being written up for having close friendships with other girls, homosexual relationships, or honey loving, I think is used by one superintendent a lot. Girls got their hair cut as a punishment, but also in certain eras was also not okay for girls to have male appearing haircuts. And so there's all these really strong signals that same-sex relationships between girls, kind of whether or not they were sexual, the threat to the institution was having strong, loving relationships between the girls, when part of the institution's mission in some ways was to break Pilina between Hawaiians in general.
This episode engages Hawaiian worldviews in social contexts and explores themes of sexuality, gender, and erotics. Some language and content may be considered strong or triggering. Viewer and listener discretion is advised.
Aloha mai kākou, and welcome to Kūkā Kīkī, a Mahu-led podcast where we kūkā and kīkī about Kanaka sexuality, gender, erotics, and all things Mahu. This is a gathering of friends and community rooted in connection, joy, and resilience. Today we are joined by Dr. Maile Arvin, an assistant professor at the Department of Ethnic Studies at UH Manoa. In this Kūkā Kīkī, she shares the stories of her kupuna alongside her research on the Kawailoa Training School and other reformatory institutions. She reflects on how these institutions tried to sever Pilina Hawaii in an attempt to reform Hawaiian youth into white sexual citizens. She explores how girls and boys of these reformatories resisted the pathology of these institutions by expressing their Pilina kupuna, and why uncovering these kinds of histories are vital for healing today. Aloha e Maile, mahalo for joining us today. I'm so excited and honored to have you in our space today for Kūkā Kīkī. Your paper about the Kawailoa Training School for girls is incredibly informative, very important work, and one of those contributions to the Hulili special issue that really stands out because of how it dives into relationality and Pilina between these wahine and girls in the school, but also about how regulation shaped those Pilina, regulation around bodies and relationships shaped those Pilina, but also the resistance that came through as well. Before we dive deep into your essay, I'd like to just ask you about your ʻāina hanau and your ʻāina kupuna. I always ask our listeners to share a little bit about their ʻāina kupuna and ʻāina hanau, as well as the kupuna that has shaped you and helped form you into the person you are today.
Sure. Well, mahalo nui for having me here. My ʻāina hanau is actually Kentucky. I was born in Lexington, Kentucky. My dad, his name was Tracy Arvin. He was from there. He met my mom at Bellows Air Force Base in the 70s. Nice. My mom is from Waimanalo. So yeah, my ʻāina kupuna, I probably consider Waimanalo. My mom lives there now. My cousins still live on the homestead where my mom grew up. And
nani.
Yeah.
So you grew up going to the homestead as a kid in Waimanalo and connecting with ohana there.
Right. Yeah. So I grew up in Kentucky, but we come back a lot in the summers and stay at my tutu's house there. She passed away when I was maybe 8. But yeah, her name was Lillian Kaehukai Mahi Awo. And yeah, I think she's a good person to bring up as we're talking about this article, because she's one of the ways I got interested in the topic. So she worked at, I think she called it Ko'olau Girls Home. She worked there in the 60s and 70s, and she was a house mother. That was like her official title. And so she took care of the girls that were sentenced to that place. And so I grew up always hearing little stories about it, mostly filtered through my mom and my aunties and uncles who would go visit their mom while she was working there. And I just was always kind of curious, like, what that place was and why it didn't seem to be the same now, or, when I was a kid or now. And then, when I was doing research for my first book, I came across some interviews that sociologists had done with girls there at that institution in the 1930s.
Wow.
And it just opened up so many more questions about, like, what was this place? Like, what happened here? And so, I think my tutu always felt like, from what I understand, from what I remember of her, and from what my mom and siblings say, is that she always felt like, it was her responsibility at Kuleana to take care of these mostly Hawaiian girls, because she felt like their families had failed them in various ways, or that they were coming from homes that weren't good. And I'm sure in some cases that was true. And also, I think doing this research has just raised a lot more questions about what good and bad means when we're referring to family and children. And so speaking about my tutu, also as I was doing the research, have been doing research on the girls' home, I found out that home that she worked at is in Kailua. It's now the site of the Hawaii Youth Correctional Facility.
Interesting.
But before that institution was at that site, it was actually in town, in Mo'iliili, on what is now like around the dorms on lower UH campus. And I think it's been a little harder to find information about that institution. It closed in 1928 when they built the new institution in Kailua. And they moved the girls out there, in part because they felt the girls that were incarcerated in Mo'iliili were too close to, like, the vices of town and, like, sailors coming in. And there were various reports in the newspapers of girls, like, kind of immediately when they were paroled, like, getting, kind of swept up in, like, prostitution and things. Anyway, so that's part of how they justified moving the girls to Kailua, to be in a more rural area, more separated. But as I was finding out more about the Mo'iliili institution, I found that actually my tutu's mom, her name was Rachel Simerson Mahi. Mahi would become her married name. I found a picture of her as a girl and she was incarcerated in the girls' industrial school at Mo'iliili. Which is heavy and painful, and just, again, I feel like the more I do research on this topic, just like, instead of having answers, there are just more and more questions. And
there's even that familial element to it, like it's part of the genealogy of struggle in your family as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow. And our kupuna are so important, and it's incredible that you got to learn these stories, but also to hear about your grandmother and her, approaches to care, and her beliefs around wahine at the time, and thinking about too, like, what influenced those beliefs. Was it just observation, or actually seeing, family dynamics, or, were there racially motivated sort of influences that might have influenced the way our elders thought about our people generally? So that's, you bring up a bunch of important questions, I think, in thinking about these institutions. I think this leads us into talking more about your work, and particularly this piece you contributed to Hulili. about the Kawailoa Training School for Girls. Would you mind sharing more about this essay and the work and kind of what has come from it, from this essay being published?
Yeah, sure. And I should say too, I wrote it with one of my students, Eliana Massey, who she was here a bit in the summer, but she's gone. She graduated from the University of Utah in the spring, and now she has a job back at the University of Utah. And she was really the one who saw the call for the special issue and was really motivated to want us to submit something. So,
shout out to Eliana.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But so, like I said, a lot of the research came out of me trying to understand like what this place was. And at first, the project has developed into more trying to understand not just that girls' institution, but kind of the whole system. So there was also a boys' institution. There was also a reformatory that opened under the Hawaiian Kingdom. And I'm just really fascinated in trying to get a grasp on like the genealogy of these places. But for this essay, we did focus mostly on the girls' school. We wanted, in connection with this special issue on the mahui, to like really think about kind of queerness and relationships as as they were both kind of policed and lived at by the girls at Kawailoa. So I think one of the primary things to know is that girls who got sent to this training school, the way that we know about this place mostly, like from times before people living today remember it, is from archival documents in the Hawaii State Archives, which we know is only providing a certain view for the most part, right? But one of the things that is well documented is kind of like the so-called crimes that the girls committed to get sent to a training school. We know a lot of statistics about the demographics of the girls that got sent there. We know a lot about like the length of their sentences and things like that from the bureaucratic documents that are preserved. And, the really striking thing about the girls, and in contrast to the boys who got sent to their own institution, is that almost all of the so-called crimes the girls were incarcerated for, they were all like sexual in nature. And they're incredibly vague. So even though it's like well documented, sometimes I have no ideas, like still after years of studying this, like what it actually meant. I think what it actually meant, was just very subjective and very racist.
Absolutely.
And so, the official language is like sexual waywardness or sexual delinquency, or words that are very kind of outdated today. And so it's a struggle to understand them from that perspective. But even in their own context, like, they're not ever fully defined. There's nothing that's like, oh, a girl, if she like breaks her family's curfew, that means she'll get sent here. Or if she goes to a party that has a lot of boys, or if she's seen in Chinatown, or, there's no like strict accounting like that. But we do get little mo'olelo here and there about certain girls, and we know that basically girls could get sent there for anything from like, going to a party where there were boys, and someone complained, and all the way to they were pregnant and they weren't married, or they were, involved in prostitution in some way, right? And so, it's really heavy that
it is.
That girls in particular, and the majority were Kanaka Maoli girls, were getting like locked up for like 1 to sometimes like 10 years for these so-called crimes that even by the standards of that time were not crimes if you were white.
Right. Yeah, wow. You also talk about, the Pilina between the wahine, and of course being in these institutions, like Pilina as a way of surviving, in a sense. They were pathologized and criminalized in ways, and what were the relationships that were most often policed in those environments?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I just spoke about how girls kind of got sentenced to the institution, but then once they were in there, they were also, heavily observed and policed in kind of this whole different new way, because often, so we know this mostly from like handbooks or like reports where girls are being written up for having close friendships with other girls. Sometimes explicitly in the reports, they're referred to as like homosexual relationships, or there's all kind of funny like language about it from the 1920s and 30s and 40s, like honey loving, I think, is used by one superintendent a lot. There's also things like girls, in certain eras, girls got their hair cut as a punishment.
Wow.
But also in certain eras, it was also not okay for girls to have short, so like male appearing haircuts. And so there's all these really strong signals that like same-sex relationships between girls, kind of whether or not they were sexual, like the handbooks seem to suggest that it was really like the threat to the institution was like having strong, loving relationships between the girls, when the institution, I think part of the institution's mission in some ways was to really break Pilina between Hawaiians in general, right? And so that's most obvious between like the girls and their parents or their extended ohana, because while they were in the institution, they could only visit on certain days. Also, girls could be sent there from any island, and so, obviously, ohana that were on other islands, it's really hard to go visit Oahu, and at that time, right, in rural Kailua, as like an extra, the transportation from Honolulu and all of that, they made it really difficult. And so like that was one purpose, was like to break connections, to break relationships and closeness between children and their families, so that the children would be more like moldable into like the gendered ideas that white settlers of the territorial period had. But and then within the institution, if girls became close with each other, that became threatening, because then, they're not being punished if they have relationships, right? Or if they're creating these other forms of ohana, when the whole point of the institution was to like break that. Right. Right. And so, I think in some ways it's all really hard to understand, and in some ways it's like they make it very clear, know, like kind of the violence that is intended and is happening.
Wow. This is kind of an off the side question. Did you see any regulations on olelo Hawaii, the use of olelo Hawaii in the institution as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think by the time the girls are at Kawailoa, which it'll be mostly, it's like 1928, 1929 that they're there. I think unfortunately, because of all the histories, colonial violence that has also been happening beyond that institution, I don't think a lot of them had olelo. Although in some years it seems like the superintendents did kind of support that. Like I think at least we saw one reference to like a Hawaiian class. Wow. So it's also complicated in those ways, right? Like it's not one thing, especially over the whole like span of time it was operating. Yeah.
That is interesting. I mean, severing ties, Pilina, traditional ways of relating, but then we're going to throw in a Hawaiian class, see what that does, kind of interesting. You also write about how the Pilina there was queered. Can you talk a little bit more about your usage of queered and perhaps its relationship to settler colonial structures in relation to Hawaiian modes of being and relating in the world?
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, I think we wanted to employ the term like carefully, in a way that did not like supersede Hawaiian identifications, meaning like I think there are many, as probably many of the other articles in the special issue explore, there are many different forms of relationships that Hawaiians had that might be deemed queer by Western standards today. But we're trying to be clear that we're not trying to impose like a queer identity backwards onto girls who may or may not have had like same-sex relationships, but we're trying to show like how like it by kind of the territorial government. So the school was run by the territorial government, like by the school criminalizing Hawaiian girls for expressing sexuality, and then the punishment was like strict removal from and prevention from seeing their family. Like in a larger way, the state, the territorial government was, really pathologizing ohana, like as, these girls in particular ways, right? And likely the girls that got sent there were, working class, like poorer Hawaiians who didn't have the same kind of protections maybe that other Hawaiians in society at that time would have had. Maybe I'll start here. So This didn't happen to me because I grew up mostly in Kentucky, but I hear that even some friends of my generation, but especially my mom's generation, they would hear like, don't act up or we're gonna send you to the girls' home or the boys' home. And I just think that's like somewhat superficial, but also because it's so common, like so many people have that story, it kind of shows like how deeply internalized some of these ideas about like being a good girl or a good boy are, even still today in our families. And I guess that's what I think that's what we're trying to explain and get at in a deeper way in the article, and show that it's not just same-sex relationships that are being criminalized. It's like our whole way of life, like our whole way of having families, like whether they might be read as straight or queer today. Like it was everyone, right, that was being, maybe not everyone, but like, kind of, it was Hawaiian ways of life that was being queered to some extent. And I think what we have to do today is, I guess, like just like the word queer has been reclaimed as one of empowerment, right? I think part of our work today with decolonization is also to undo that work of like understanding certain family members as bad girls or bad boys, and certain forms of relating to each other as like too much or extra or
out of the norm.
And like really reclaim that, even as it is hard to do because we live in a colonized society still yet.
Yes. It makes me wonder too about how appropriate Pilina would have been defined. Did you see any examples of appropriate, so-called appropriate Pilina in your research?
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea was that girls should be chaste until they were married. That they shouldn't be in spaces where that were co-ed if they were, in their teenage years. And so another thing I think we mentioned in the article too is that out kind of from the girls' school, the training school, was to get married.
Wow.
It's just, again, kind of mind-boggling to understand like the logics of it all, because girls were sent there for being too sexual. And then in certain eras, like there was such a fear of same-sex relationships at the institution that then one superintendent instituted like a day where their boyfriends from outside could come visit. So, it was just like heterosexuality was the norm.
Right.
But even if the girls had gotten in trouble for being heterosexual, and that's what got them in the institution, then that also became part of the like cure, but only if it was approved by kind of whoever was in charge of the institution at the time.
It really sounds too like these institutions were trying to create or turn these wahine into forms of property that could be like sold off, or not sold off, but through marriage, like then become the property of a man, like a docile, just piece of property, basically. And that is also interesting too, that they would use heterosexuality as, the reason to incarcerate these wahine, expressions of that, but then also as like the cure for their misbehaving. That must have been so confusing, and I have a feeling I would have ended up in one of those schools for sure. You talk about punishments too for engaging in cultural practice in any way, shape, or form. Could you share a little bit more about what you saw as forms of punishment, and also like that being related to like doing these sorts of cultural things?
Yeah, so I think the thing Eliana and I have been struck by in certain eras at both the boys' school and the girls' school were that like cultural practices were not always, but definitely in certain eras used as the punishment. So for the boys at the Waile'e Industrial School for Boys on the North Shore, the boys who were extra bad, so-called, bad by the standards of the institution because they were trying to run away or protest or, just be children. The baddest boys would, they could get sent to like so-called dark cells where it was, solitary confinement, but also consistently they were always assigned to work in the kalo. And so it's actually really beautiful today that North Shore Community Land Trust is restoring the kalo at that land. And I've been really lucky to be part of that. Here and there, and hopefully more that I'm here more permanently. But I think Kawailoa Training, who is one of the main caretakers of the land right now, when he heard that, that working in the lo'i was like one of the harshest punishments that the boys could have at that place, I think I remember him saying that's diabolical, because it's really twisted to turn something that is so important to Kanaka
into a form of punishment,
right? And our relative, right, in our kupuna, in a really deep way, and it's very chilling to see. That was another way that the institutions were trying to destroy the Pilina between Hawaiians. And at Kawailoa, it seems like the girls weren't always consistently made to work. I don't know if they had lo'i, because the boys' school supplied poi to a lot of the state institutions. The girls had like produce and stuff. They had a dairy and a piggery. that the girls in certain eras worked in. But we see in some eras that the girls were made to wear holoku as a punishment.
Interesting. Holoku.
Yeah. Which is just so confusing, right? Because it's like, that's what we wear at like our precious graduations and parties now. But at the time, I mean, it seemed quite intentional to make girls wear that as a punishment and to show them as somehow backwards or like out of step with like the modern expectations of what a girl should wear.
Wow, that's interesting, thinking about the holoku as being a punishment, something that we adore today as a symbol of like a unique Hawaii style, but it is twisted again because it would have been the clothing that their tutu would have worn, you know, mu'umu'u or holoku, but twisting that and turning it into something to be ashamed of, or, you know, our traditional garb created by Hawaiians. And I think that's so twisted. Yeah, and with the lo'i too, that I didn't know that, but a part of me wonders too if there was some joy though, even working in the lo'i, like for those, the harshest punishment, but they're like, hey, I'm screwing you guys over because this is actually what I wanted to do today. I don't want to be indoors all day. I want to work in the lo'i because it brings such joy, you know. So I wonder if part of it, if there was these experiences of joy for the boys, I hope anyways, in the lo'i. Yeah. Wow. Mahalo for sharing this. You know, you also talk about too how the girls found ways to continue, like to resist, and found ways to build Pilina regardless of, you know, what the institution was doing. Can you share a little bit more about these forged Pilina?
Yeah. Well, I think, like I already said, certainly the girls were always creating friendships and ohana in their own ways within the institution, which really upset different superintendents. But they're all there together. Like, what are they going to do? And like, it definitely, they ran away all the time.
They did?
Oh, yeah. Like in certain years, it's like basically the entire population had run away at least once.
Wow.
Often multiple times. Many of the girls never like fully submitted to what they were intended to submit to.
I love that. That's awesome. So they did resist at every turn. Obviously, running away is a form of resistance, building friendships, even though with like the fear of being reprimanded and even separated and isolated further. I think these institutions are kind of overlooked. This is one of the first times actually when I heard about the North Shore, what is it called? The North Shore Community Land Trust. Mm-hmm. We did work there at the lo'i, and that's when the first time I heard that we even had institutions like this. Something that's kind of brushed under the carpet, right? But you know, it seems like there's a whole kind of genealogy of these institutions springing up, particularly right during the territorial era, but even you said during the kingdom, but would this have been in the latter part of the kingdom?
Yeah, the first reformatory opened in 1865. Under Lot Kapoiva. You know, I again still maybe have more questions than answers at this point. But been working on translating new PEPA articles related to that institution. That institution was located at what's now Kaʻilani Elementary in Kapalama. I think from kind of the official statements of the officials of the kingdom at that time, what I understand is that they understood a reformatory to be, you know, like a modern institution that they should have.
Right.
Like many of the other modern institutions they were trying to learn from and implement in Hawaii. I think it's really clear in some of the earliest years of that institution that sometimes parents would initially be on board because they're like, oh yeah, my kid is running away all the time, I don't know what to do. And so they would get sentenced to, they called it the kula ho'opolole. But then you start to see letters in the archives from these parents being like, okay, can I get my kid back now? And, we don't always know what the reply was, but in general, they were sentenced for a year or more.
Wow.
For things like truancy. For the boys, both in the kingdom and territory period, a lot of the so-called crimes were truancy, petty theft.
What is truancy, if you don't mind me asking?
Just like skipping school.
Oh, okay. Wow, something as simple. We used to do it all the time.
Yes. So yeah, can you imagine for skipping school, I don't know, maybe once or twice,
Wow.
you get sentenced to an institution.
For a year or maybe more.
Yeah. And
So theft was another one.
Mm-hmm. So you have all these letters in Olelo that are from parents being like, this is kaumaha, like why, like please, like send our Kīkī back.
Yeah.
And I think it's just one of those examples of which there are others from that time period where, Kanaka are remarkably open to like adopting other ways of being with the intention that it might help our people.
Right.
But when it becomes clear that it's not helping, a lot of people resisted and protested. And so in the kingdom era, there were efforts to abolish that institution that were introduced in the legislature. There were all these letters from parents. There were various critiques written in the New Pepa. It was never fully successful in shutting that institution down. And then, the overthrow happened, and then, that reformatory just came under the Republic of Hawaii and then the territory, and they moved the boys to the North Shore in 1903.
Wow, and so far very rural over there.
Yeah, exactly. Same logic says it's too close to Honolulu and all the vices and their ohana, and we need to get them as far away as possible.
That's incredible that I think also the parents reaching out and voicing their concerns on it. Just that story I think is so important, that there were people who saw through this perhaps and were organizing around abolishing it just because they saw how detrimental it was to the well-being of Keiki. It wasn't the other way around where it was benefiting them in any way, shape, or form. I'm also thinking about too the possible relationship between boarding schools on the continent, right? And these institutions, if there's even a direct correlation between policy or kind of basing or it being a blueprint in which these institutions in Hawaii were established.
Yeah, that's a remarkably complicated question and comparison. Because on the one hand, yes, they're doing a lot of the same things as what was happening with Native American boarding schools, but definitely the chain of command or the laws that enabled that to happen for Native American children, it wasn't the same. But yeah, it's complicated in various ways, including a few years ago, the Department of Interior released this report about boarding schools with the intention of having some kind of federal reckoning with it, and they included Native Hawaiians in the report. Probably as many know, they included Kamehameha schools, Lahaina Luna, and Hilo boarding school, which were all boarding schools in the sense that they had borders, right? And certainly there, at least historically, right, there were issues of the curriculum being assimilative into white ideals. But my understanding from my research is that those three institutions were relatively privileged, right? Children or families wanted their children to go there. Whereas the reformatory, these industrial schools and training schools, they weren't elective, you know, like they weren't
wasn't a choice.
Aspirational.
Yeah.
They were literally prisons for children.
Yeah.
And so, like, I think that is shared with Native American boarding schools. Although, again, there's differences too, because Native American children were kind of targeted wholesale, whereas in Hawaii, it was so like only the bad kids. So like technically the kids had to have committed a crime.
A crime first.
Right. And so technically children of any race could be and were sent to the institutions in Hawaii, but like a vast majority of the children were Kanaka.
No, thank you for sharing that. Sorry for the complex question.
No, it's just
it's a lot.
The topic is complex.
Yeah, it is complex.
And that's a natural question that I get asked a lot, and I just wish there was like a shorter version, but there's not.
Isn't.
Yeah.
When did these institutions start shutting down, and what were the reasons?
Yeah, so the boys' industrial school at Waialae closed officially in 1950, although, like from the records. Although in talking to people at Waialae, a lot of people have memories of the boys being there for longer. So that's, again, a question mark we still have. But when that institution, that location closed, they sent the older boys to, they called them like forestry camps on Molokai and Hawaii Island. And then those programs didn't last too long, but that's where they were in like early 50s. And they sent the younger boys to across the street from Kawailoa, what they called Ko'olau Boys Home. Effectively Kawailoa and Ko'olau Boys Home, they never fully closed. I mean, they ended as separate institutions, but I think in early 1960s, they combined and were renamed after statehood to be the Hawaii Youth Correctional Facility.
So their legacy continues in a sense.
Yeah.
Wow, there's so much to think about. I mean, it's heartbreaking hearing these stories and recognizing that in a sense we're still failing our next generation, our Kīkī, with these institutions that, just seem to criminalize modes of being that just don't conform to the everyday. I mean, I'm sure it's more complex than that, but I think historically, like you were talking about, there's this criminalization of modes of being that don't conform to the white citizen and what that looks like. And I'm a person who loves stories of resistance, and so hearing over and over again that people resisted being confined and caged like animals, really. They found ways to continue to express themselves, to continue to enact their humanity and their Pilina in productive and magical ways. I think we're getting closer to the end. How do these stories reshape our understanding of, particularly with Wahine, Kanaka women's resilience and care under colonial control? I only ask that just because we're talking about Pilina, we're talking about Pilina, we're talking about resistance. And I know we started talking about the Kane and the boys' school, but I think moving it back to our Wahine I think that's really important.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm biased, but Wahine have so much, resilience, like you said. So I just have like really strong images of the girls at the training school as just being like irrepressible and beautiful in their own ways. And again, like sometimes people, when they ask the question about comparing to Native boarding schools, what they want to know is like, how bad was it in, like, what were the conditions like of their lives inside the institution? And again, it's hard for us to know exactly, and it varied at different times. I think even compared to the boys' institution, the girls' institution seems to have been better living conditions, right? They had newer buildings. A lot of Hawaiian women who were teachers who were trying to take care of them. And yet, I think sometimes when that comparison is being inquired about, and I say, well, you know, like their daily lives didn't look like the daily lives of children at some boarding schools, Native children at some boarding schools, which, you know, were often in much dire conditions. I guess that maybe sometimes the person who asks feels better about it, which I understand. I think the thing that I would like them to understand that's harder and takes longer to explain is no matter like the experience that the girl had at the institution, it's still a violence to take a child out of their ohana, right? And that violence is intergenerational in the same way that the violence to Native American children at boarding schools is intergenerational. It's not that the living conditions don't matter, but that's not the only violence.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's harder for me to know how the girls navigated some of that. I mean, I guess I can share this story from my ohana. So my great grandmother, Rachel Simerson, who was at the Mo'ili Girls' School, nobody in my family knew that she had been sent there. She was there in like 1921. She has this really amazing, beautiful, defiant photo. Like she's making like, you know, the hardest face in the photo. I could tell that she was my great grandma because of her eyebrows looked very much like
yours.
like my grandma's.
Ohana.
Yeah. You know, the stories that I have about her, she passed before I was born, but you know, my family says that she often, the main story I have heard about her is that she often ran away from her family, her own family, after she had got married and had kids. But then they also say like, oh, but before she like went wherever she went for a few days, she would make sure the fridge was full of food for the family and that the house was all clean. But then she'd take off.
Interesting.
And I just think, again, like the way that story has been told in my family for a long time, I think has been like, oh, she was kind of crazy and like irresponsible. Like, what was she doing leaving her kids, right? But this makes it make sense in a different way, you know? Like, one of her formative experiences was being in an institution where probably the only freedom she would have is to run away. And she was there as a child, and so in a way she never got to be a child. Or she was there in formative years where she might have learned what it meant to be a parent, and so when she got out, she didn't. You know, it's another example, I think, of how the violence of the institutions, right, it's not just that one person is taken away. It's not just like that they had that bad year that they were gone, right? It's the whole, like they miss so much, and that the things that are missed, you can't fix it easily, right? And it gets perpetuated in all these ways that nobody can predict or expect. But I think, at least for me, knowing that this is part of her story, you know, it just makes me have more aloha for her.
Absolutely.
And hope that I can convince more of my ohana too today to see that story in a different light.
Yeah. Not so much in this sort of, it was like her own will that she was just, there were other forces at play, this desire for freedom, and then leaving an institution, but then being wrapped up in another institution of marriage, and all the kuleana that comes. I get it. You need a break. You need to be able to just get out and have your freedom, especially when you've been fighting your whole life for that. I absolutely get that. My mom was similar, actually. She loved to go holo holo for a few days, and we'd be like, okay, bye. But it was because she needed that. She needed to go and be a bird and just go into the forest and live her life. So
I think that speaks to like how Western ideas of motherhood are so unhealthy for mothers, right?
Right.
And I think Kanaka had healthier models of how to raise children, which did not depend on
one person,
one wahine.
That's a really good point you bring up. We were talking with Lani about the collapse of the Hawaiian family and the extended family, that being a big part of it too. So much pressure is put on one parent and one wahine to raise multiple keiki, work, and without the help in doing it independently. And there's like this emphasis on it must be done independently. If you ask for help, somehow you're not doing it right or something. But our kupuna did ask for help, and they did. Others raised, the keiki as well, multiple people. So that's a really good point you bring up. Mahalo. To all you mothers out there. That message is for you. I think we are at the tail end of our Kūkā. I always end these sessions with a little momi, a little pearl of insight or wisdom that you'd like to share with our listeners, something that you weren't able to share, that my questions weren't able to cover. Feel free. And if you need time to think about it, that's okay too.
Yeah, I think, I hope listeners or viewers, I know that the topic is heavy, and I think, a common reaction is like, oh, how do you research that? It's so sad.
Yeah.
And one answer I usually have for that is that it doesn't feel like I have a choice, when you find your great-grandmother's picture. And that's true too. Actually, I meant to say for my co-author, Eliana, also found I think it was her great-great-grandmother was also in the institution that my great-grandmother was in.
Chicken skin, wow.
Yeah, but I guess I hope people can see, one, that I'm not trying to paint our kupunas just like sad victims, because that's not accurate, right? They were running away all the time, and families were, parents were trying to get their kids back. So I guess I think there are ways that, there is healing work happening. What I want to say is that I'm not looking into this just to arbitrarily talk about a sad part of our history, but because I think it's so crucial to understand in order to be able to heal from it. And so I think if it's one of those things where if we don't address it or understand what happened, we'll keep perpetuating some of the ideas that got embedded in our ohanas from those eras, right? And so in a way, the work is very, it's heavy, but that's not all it is, I guess. Right. And I hope that people find value in it.
I think they will, Maile. Mahalo.
Yeah, mahalo.
Mahalo for your time and for being so vulnerable about your ohana, and also about, this work that you're doing. I can tell that you really have aloha for these girls and these boys, and what they went through in their mo'olelo, and that, bringing that mo'olelo to the surface again. I think it's time, because there's a lot of healing work that needs to happen, and there may be other families who may have withheld that information, but it being brought to light, and understanding the complexities around it might allow them to open up a little bit more about their experiences. So mahalo for the work that you're doing.
Oh, mahalo for having me.
It's an honor. Mahalo nui for sipping the tea on Kūkā Kīkī. Until next time, e inu I ka wai I ke kupuna, a e hoʻohainu I ka waha moʻopuna. Aloha.
girls kind of got sentenced to the institution, but then once they were in there, they were also heavily observed and policed. Girls were being written up for having close friendships with other girls, homosexual relationships, or honey loving, I think is used by one superintendent a lot. Girls got their hair cut as a punishment, but also in certain eras, it was also not okay for girls to have male appearing haircuts. And so there's all these really strong signals that same-sex relationships between girls, kind of whether or not they were sexual, it was really like the threat to the institution was like having strong, loving relationships between the girls, when part of the institution's mission in some ways was to break Pilina between Hawaiians in general. And so I just spoke about how girls kind of got sentenced to the institution, but then once they were in there, they were also heavily observed and policed in kind of this whole different new way, because often so this mostly from like handbooks or like reports where girls were being written up for having close friendships with other girls. Sometimes explicitly in reports, they're referred to as like homosexual relationships, or there's all kind of funny like language about it from the 1920s and 30s and 40s, like honey loving, I think, is used by one superintendent a lot. There's also things like girls, in certain areas, girls got their hair cut as a punishment.
Wow.
But also in certain eras, it was also not okay for girls to have short, so like male appearing haircuts. And so there's all these really strong signals that like same-sex relationships between girls, kind of whether or not they were sexual, like the handbooks seem to suggest that it was really like the threat to the institution was like having strong, loving relationships between the girls, when the institution, I think part of the institution's mission in some ways was to really break Pilina between Hawaiians in general. And so